Morning, everyone. We're still waiting for a few delegates, but I think we are going to start. Welcome to everyone after yesterday. Our first session today is going to be led by, as we said yesterday. Let me introduce the topic: mapping the field through a political economy lens. Where did the field come from? Where did the field of education and conflict come from? Who are the main players? And what are the limitations of the field? Mario, thank you very much. I look forward to this, as I look forward to any of your sessions.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. And really what I would like to do today is to provide a kind of broad overview so that you can locate yourself within this field of education and emergencies, education and conflict. And I guess this is a critique of the field of education and emergencies, but it's also a critique of critique and a recognition that it's not enough just to be critical, but we also need to think about solutions, ways forward, ways to improve the situation of education in contexts of conflict, in situations of crisis. And particularly in this field, as we'll see as we talk and as we move through the talk, it's a very applied field. It's very close to the challenges and the demands and the issues that educators, teachers, policymakers face, children, parents, in situations of violent conflict and protracted conflict. So I'm conscious of those two and trying to balance them out. What I want to do is kind of go through, in a sense, a narrative, which is also a personal narrative. It's also a history of the field, but it's also a history of my last 20 years of engagement with that field. So I think that I will interject throughout some anecdotal reflections on my own experiences within that field. So what I would like to do to begin with is to start to kind of locate the field historically and try to move then on to understanding some of its challenges, and then move towards an illustrative case study which illuminates aspects of some of the critique that I'm going to develop, and then try to finish with some suggestions of the way forward for the field and some possibilities, and also a reflection that the peer network and the ideas around it are also embedded in this critique, and the peer network itself is a small grain of sand, as we say in Spanish, to contribute to trying to redress that. So starting with the field of education, conflict, education and emergencies, it really emerges as a kind of cognate conscious field in the early 1990s, and it emerges out of a challenge. As many of you know that have studied education, in 1990, after a decade of structural adjustment reforms in sub-Saharan Africa and real challenges in terms of the situation of education around the world, but particularly in low-income countries, many international actors, international organizations met in Jomtien and set a framework of education for all, an agreement that committed to education for all and a range of targets. A decade later, as often happens with these international agreements, a second meeting is called to reflect on how far the objectives that were set in Jomtien, Thailand, were achieved. And in the run-up to that period, so in the late 1990s, there was a recognition that many of the out-of-school children in the world, at least 50%, often more, were located in conflict-affected contexts. So the question was raised about, well, what is particular about the situation of conflict for the provision of education? What do we need to understand? How can we redress this if we want to move forward and ensure that more children have access to school? Out of that process of deliberation, the INEE was created. The INEE, the acronym, stands for the Interagency Network of Education in Emergencies. It was created in the run-up to the Dakar EFA Forum. And it was made up of a range of agencies that appear in this field and will appear in this talk: UNICEF, Save the Children, a range of international NGOs, range of national governments and donors like DFID and others were engaged in the creation of this interagency network on education in emergencies, which started to think about what are the practical issues and challenges of delivering education in the context of conflict. Part of this thinking was influenced by the experience already accrued of refugee education that had emerged from the Second World War onwards. It was also influenced by the 1996 United Nations Mackle report on the impact of armed conflict on children. And a lot of the focus in the initial period was really on understanding education and education communities as victims of war and conflict. And of course, that's a logical way to think about it, because we know that in the middle of wars and conflicts, often education systems are targeted, children are targeted for recruitment, teachers are often targeted either for recruitment or killed or forcibly displaced. And education in a range of ways beyond the physical also becomes victim of conflict. But as we realized pretty quickly, education can't only be understood, and education systems can't only be understood as a victim of conflict. Education can also be complicit in conflict. It can be complicit in the production of conflict. And a landmark article in 2000 by Bush and Saltarelli talked about the two faces of education, and that really opened up the recognition of these multiple relationships between education and war, and started to enable us to think about the way that education could be both a driver for peace but also a driver for war. And we needed to look at different dimensions of the education system in terms of its delivery, its funding, its curriculum, how it was supported by international actors or not, and a range of different dimensions to recognize that while education can be a liberating force and has been for many people around the world across many generations, education can also undermine confidence, destroy people's opportunities, and not everybody has access to that education, whether good or bad. And I think that part of that realization of the two sides of this discussion, which expanded as we go on to multiple sides, really lays the foundation for many of the issues that have been reflected upon over the years. And in a sense, the broader field raised an important issue, which was that for many decades, but particularly since the 1950s, much education policy and much education thinking has been rooted in human capital theory. And human capital theory really tries to understand education as an economic good, as something that can both support the economic development of individuals, but also nation states. And of course, that's an important understanding of education, which we all respect. But we also need to understand that education can do so much more than just support the economy or undermine it. It also can build social cohesion or not. It can also build legitimation within the society. And the field of education and conflict, I think, started to shift the lens a little and make us think about the important social role that education can play, the important possible and potential peace-building role that education could play. And it's not all about getting education to support the economy. But there was also recognition amongst many of the advocacy actors, the NGOs, the international actors within this field, that education was often not a priority within and in the midst of conflict. Save the Children produced a campaign and a well-known report entitled Last in Line, which raised those issues about the small amounts of funding that went to education in conflict-affected contexts. Other international funds and campaigns, such as Education Cannot Wait, have emerged to really try to lobby the international community and to gather more funds to direct at situations of education in situations of conflict or protracted conflict. And the whole argument often revolved around the question of, well, where does education fit in towards this complex issue of conflict within countries? And one of those arguments was around the kind of humanitarian period in the midst of conflict. And the case was made that education, just like health, just like shelter, just like food, actually was a life-saving issue, and that we needed to prioritize that within the United Nations humanitarian cluster. And that was a very complex debate that was engaged in, which was eventually won in the early 2000s. And education now is part of what's known as the humanitarian cluster. So when there is a crisis, those different sectors from health, housing, food, come together, and education is part of that. Nevertheless, there are strong debates, and I think legitimate debates, around the question of whether each of those dimensions, each of those systems are equally life-saving, and whether education should be given a similar priority or a lesser one. But what's clear is that conflicts have lasted progressively longer and longer, between 10, 15, 20 years, the situation of Palestinians being the most extreme example of how long a conflict can last. And so the idea that you can wait to sort out the education system until after a conflict has finished has become often an untenable argument. Precisely because it would mean that 1, 2, often 3 generations of people would lose out on their education. Over the years, there has been an impressive growth in both understanding of the relationship between education and conflict, and also a growth in funding and projects and delivery, basically emergent from lots of this lobbying. This is a timeline of a kind of orthodox understanding of the emergence and evolution of the field of education and conflict. And you'll kind of see on the top some international agreements that are kind of landmark agreements or projects that have emerged out of this. So from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights up to the rights of the child, and onwards to the creation of a range of particular initiatives within the field of education and conflict. And you'll see underneath a range of historical events, political events, the end of the Second World War in the 1940s, Marshall Plan, onwards to a range of armed and violent conflicts in Central America, up to 9/11. And as we move on to a range of things, and we could extend that timeline to the current crises in a range of parts of the world. And in the middle, you'll see an attempt in this report, which was produced by the Brookings Institute. Rebecca Winthrop was the lead author on the Centre for Universal Education, where they talk about 3 periods of understanding the evolution of the field. The early period, which, as I talked about, came from refugee education, where there was a proliferation of attempts to deal with education and education crisis in the midst of conflict, and then a period of consolidation, which really is the period that I talked about from the foundation of the INEE and the run-up to Dakar. And then a third stage, which is a phase of collaboration with other sectors, so that there you start to talk about example that I've already given about the humanitarian cluster and education's engagement in that, but also reaching out to security and engaging with issues of peace building. So in a sense, a kind of, the first phase would be seen as a kind of a scattering of initiatives, the second, a consolidation of a field, and the third, that field reaching out and engaging with other different sectors. Now, my own journey really has spanned that post-2000 period, and my really first engagement with the field as a kind of in its institutional form was when I began doing some research in the mid to late 2000s on the relationship between education and peace building. And from 2008, along with Professor Alan Smith from the University of Ulster and a range of colleagues, we carried out some case studies exploring the relationship between education and peace building in Sierra Leone, in Lebanon and Nepal. And in the findings from that research, were taken up and used by UNICEF and their funder, which was the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs at that time, to develop a much broader program, which existed from 2012 to 2016 and was a 200 million UNICEF program that operated in 15 countries, which really attempted to use the education sector as a kind of vehicle to support processes of peace building. Essentially, out of the early case studies and the work that we were doing during this period of implementation of the UNICEF work, we developed a framework which tried to understand the relationship between education as system, as process, as transformatory opportunity, and situations of armed and violent conflict. And that required us to engage with issues and the literatures around what underpins conflict. And I'll talk more later on today when we do the theories, and tomorrow when we talk about the literature. But in a sense, there are many competing understandings of why people go to war. And for us, it was very important to understand that often underpinning armed conflicts are inequalities, injustices, and that in order to address that within the education system, we need to explore inequalities, injustices within the education system and try to redress them. And the 4Rs really was a mechanism for us to understand that. And the 4Rs approach that we developed drew on Nancy Fraser's understanding of social justice and looked at different dimensions. So the 3 dimensions, which are well known by many of us, on issues of redistribution, which is about resources and economics, issues of recognition, which is about identity, gender, race, class, religion, and representation, which is about issues of having access to decisions that are made about you, whether that be participation in trade unions or participation in elections, but really these three different dimensions reflect struggles over economic injustice, cultural identity injustice, misrecognition, and democratic participation, which reflects a history of social struggles around the world in different, across different decades. And our argument was that in different conflicts, those different injustices manifested themselves in different ways, and the education system could be a contributory factor, both in reproducing the conditions of conflict, but also redressing them and building a fairer, more equal society. But the fourth R that we developed was really to recognize the need for reconciliation. And that's been very influenced by the work of Mahmoud Mamdani and others that work on issues of post-conflict reconciliation, truth, justice. You know, when we talk about reconciliation, it's about picking up the pieces after conflict and how do we bring communities together and what's the role of education within that. And there are real tensions, I think, between addressing the roots of a conflict inside education and beyond, the three R's, and the reconciliation dimension, which is about how do we build communities after conflict. And of course, South Africa is an illustrative example for Mahmoud Mamdani of the political need to balance the redress of inequalities and the redresses of injustices with the need to bring people together. And the balance can always be debated, but I think that dynamic of addressing roots and legacies and understanding the relationality between that is a political act. And education, I think, is an important dimension to that, and we could look at different ways. Now, the importance of this is that this kind of framework leads you to start exploring the education system in relation to those issues of injustices and legacies, and to start to reflect on those. And that's exactly what happened in the UNICEF program. In those different 15 countries, political economy conflict analysis took place, which started to analyze different national government systems. And this, of course, produced tensions. And the project, which finished in 2016, was offered a continued funding by the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but UNICEF walked away from it. And this was confusing for us, having invested so many years in working on this project and working on the relationship between education and peace building. And so we tried to understand what was happening. And what seems to have happened is that these kinds of analysis and these kinds of programs put UNICEF in a difficult situation. As many of you know who live in many African countries, UNICEF is present in many countries at the behest of the national government, and the national government can also withdraw that invitation. The project was pointing out within the education system the inequalities, the injustices, and this would make life quite difficult for the UNICEF ambassadors who represent UNICEF. And, you know, relatively compared to the broader budget of UNICEF in each country, the resources that were going towards this work on peace building and education was relatively small. So eventually, UNICEF abandoned the project, the PBA was abandoned, and even moved their research, all of our research outputs and the products off the website and threw them off into obscurity. And this made me think, to really reflect on how research and practice in our field takes place. It's this kind of understanding we have of the purity of research and the independence of research and the pursuit of truth. And I think that this really led me to reflect on how research and practice in our field, you know, is very much determined by the interests of funders, agendas, and try to reflect on the meanings of all this. And this led me to explore a little bit the work of Roger Dale, who tried to, in a speech in 2014, which later produced in an article, he talked about the need to understand where fields of research emerge from. And he says that the starting point is that the complexity and significance of the relationships between fields of study as distinct and collective academic endeavors with that which they seek to explore or comment on, understand and explain are relatively rarely addressed. Exponents of such fields often seem to proceed on the assumption that they're purely driven by the sets of methods, theories, concepts, approaches, and so on that have been developed in the name of, in his case, comparative education. We could replace that with education and conflict. So there's an idea that we research in education and emergency in the pursuit of challenges, but there's something behind that that conditions what questions we ask, why we ask them, who funds them, for what reasons and for what outcomes. And I think that the political economy and the political economy work that we're trying to do is really trying to ask those questions, to step back and start to think about where do these things come from? Where do these ideas come from? And of course, if you do alternatively map the conditions of the production of knowledge in education and emergencies, you'll see that we've gone through, since the 1990s, a really tumultuous period from the collapse of the Soviet Union, the end of the Cold War, through to 9/11. And these transformations in geopolitics have really reorganized the nature of engagement, and also driven lots of the funding and focus of the field. So from the 1990s onwards, the great focus on conflict was also an outcome of the collapse of the Soviet Union and the emergence of a range of conflicts around the world, not least in Africa, and the re-engagement of the United Nations within the borders of nation states, which was facilitated after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the ability of the UN Security Council to intervene in what it became known as humanitarian interventions. But 9/11 is also a very important landmark in this field. Since 9/11, lots of funding went into research and practice in education and conflict, particularly in those Islamic contexts that was seen as part of the geography of the war on terror. And that has expanded into many countries around the world. And of course, there's also been a massive overspill of the many conflicts that have beset the world, with refugee crisis around the world over recent years. So all of the above have massively influenced the flow of resources to certain issues, certain places and spaces. And we also need not only to think about kind of historical events, but also the architecture of the field. Who is funding what, where, why, when, and who are those agents? And the field really is being dominated by certain big players: USAID, DFID, the World Bank, certain Middle Eastern state NGOs that emerge, government-supported NGOs, Dubai Cares, UNESCO, IIP, and the range of challenges within the way that the funding structure of the field operates is very much Western dominated. The field is very much focused on short-term challenges, short-term issues, and very aligned with Western priorities. And there is very little focus, hence part of today's focus, on the critical role of key international actors in contributing to the education conflict crisis in the respective context. So what often happens is research is framed in the sense that the conflict begins within the borders of the country. But as we know with all conflicts, they're so relational, and so many actors, international actors, are involved in conflicts that we need to really open up that lens. So back in 2008, I'd already began some work with a colleague of mine, Mikel Lopez Cardoso, on trying to review some of the literature and try to highlight some of these. And these I think still stand the test of time, that much research within our field is quite technical. and decontextualized. It doesn't really ground itself in the particular dynamics, particular context. It's often quite educationist. We say here disciplinary parochial. What I mean by that is too much focus on education and not enough relational interdisciplinary understanding. Quite methodologically nationalist. What we mean by that is that you see the problem occurring within the country and not understanding the relationships between other countries' engagement. Quite orientalist in orientation, seeing the West as benevolent and the South as a site of conflict and wrongdoing. And this links to a kind of broader, I think, ethnocentrism. Quite ahistorical and highly geopolitical, often driven by Western hegemonic objectives rather than the need, and leading to an uneven focus on some countries while ignoring others. And I think that one of the things that's emerged from that critique has been a reflection of the way that we understand international development. As I mentioned yesterday, I work at the University of Sussex, which is well known internationally for its work and research on international development. And when we teach international development, we often begin in the 1940s with the famous US President Truman Doctrine, where coming out of the Second World War, Truman, in his famous Point 4, he talks of a new reality led by the United States that's distinct from the old colonial practices of the past, and that it will be grouped in and driven by fair dealing and support for freedom-loving nations, and a range of those ideas that the US emerges as this new power, but distinct from the previous imperial powers. And of course, there's lots to debate about that whole US argument, but Uma Kutari and others from the School of Oriental African Studies in the UK actually started to raise the question of, well, why do we start teaching development studies in the 1940s and 50s? Shouldn't we recognize that actually the disjuncture or the break between development post-Second World War and colonialism is not as big as a breach as we might think? And she argues that, we need to be wary of histories of development that deny this colonial genealogy and attempt to create distinct and artificial boundaries between the exploitation of empire and the humanitarianism of development. And, she provides this quote here of Cecil Rhodes, familiar to everyone here. Imperialism was philanthropy plus a 5% dividend on investment. And I think that what's important here is to recognize that both colonialism was part carrot and part stick. That is to say that a lot of the social development ideas emerged out of attempts to control mass anti-colonial resistance in many parts of the world, in the 1930s in particular, and in development, although there is a strong social development side, a carrot side, there is also a stick side, there is also a military side. So the boundary between colonialism and development is not so strong. And, this feeds into different theories of dependency theory and other neo-Marxist understandings of the linear relationship, or the relationship of the ongoing nature of imperialism that takes different forms. And I think that development can usefully be understood in relation to that. And Mahmoud Mamdani, who many of you, of course, will know, he made an important reflection back in 2019 about development studies, where he talked about how development studies used to be the critique of empire, but has now become the language of empire. And I think that, this is part of my argument around the field of education in emergencies, is how intellectual practices and intellectual research gets entangled within imperial missions, within the geopolitics of the major powers, and whether consciously or unconsciously, whether participatory or reluctantly, often much of us get implicated within these processes. And I think the education and conflict one, precisely because it's so policy related, falls very much victim to this area. Now, to illustrate this, I just want to give a quick reflection on Afghanistan. Now, this is not about the whole field. This is a very finite aspect, but I think it's illustrative of some of these reflections. Last summer, when the US withdrew from Afghanistan, there was lots of angst amongst the development communities. There was lots of, and quite rightly, concern around the return of the Taliban for issues on gender, on social issues, on issues of schooling, but not enough analysis of the relationship between the amount of social investment since the occupation of Afghanistan and the amount of military. And, you know, thinking about this relationality within which education exists. And I just want to read you a quote from Jeffrey Sachs, who says that, according to a recent report by the Special Investigator General of Afghanistan, reconstruction, the US invested roughly 946 billion between 2001 and 2021. Yet almost 1 trillion in outlays won the US few hearts and minds. Here's why. Of that 946 billion, fully 816 billion, or 86%, went to military outlays for US troops. And the Afghan people saw little of the remaining 130 billion, with the majority going to Afghan security forces. Another 10 billion or so was spent on drug interdiction operations, while 15 billion was for US agencies operating in Afghanistan. That left a meager 21 billion in economic support for funding. Yet even much of this spending left little, if any, development on the ground, because the programs actually supported counterterrorism, bolstered national economies, and assisted in the development of effective, accessible, and independent legal systems. So, you know, essentially, just a tiny fraction of all the money that was invested in Afghanistan went to the social side. So when we try to reflect on this, I think we need to understand some of these military social imbalances or military development relationships. This, from an earlier period, talked about the imbalances between the military spending and social spending within US defense budgets, where it talked about how the Department of Defense is 210 times larger than USAID and the US State Department combined. There are substantially more people employed as musicians in defense bands than in the entire foreign service. No? So when we think about joined up policy, we need to understand and reflect on the relationship between military, diplomatic, and development spending. Now, for many people that were awake over the last 20 years, this understanding of the contradictory nature of US engagement within, and Western more general engagement within the field, would have been aware. This is a quote from the 1980s textbook reforms funded by USAID in the late 80s, in the mid 80s, a period when the Soviet Union was in occupation of Afghanistan, and the US was funding Mujahideen fighters through Pakistan to resist the Soviet occupation. And USAID funded the University of Nebraska to develop textbooks for use with Afghan refugees in camps at the Afghan-Pakistan border. Between 1984 and 94, $51 million was spent on producing and distributing over 13 million textbooks that aimed at radicalizing Afghan youth to return to fight against the Soviet occupation. And this is a maths book text, which says that the speed of a Kalashnikov bullet is 800 meters per second. If a Russian is at a distance of 3,200 meters from a mujahid, and that mujahid aims at the Russian's head, calculate how many seconds it will take for the bullet to strike the Russians in the forehead. Shocking as that is, that was known over the last 2 decades, and people that were willing at the time to reflect would have known that some of the rhetoric around the development processes that were going on in Afghanistan were precisely that, more smoke and mirrors. And Colin Powell, who passed away a couple of weeks ago, after 9/11, called a meeting of all US NGOs and made this famous quote, which I think really kind of frames some of the argument around the way that academics and NGOs have been incorporated within this imperial mission. And he says, as I speak, just as surely as our diplomats and military, American NGOs are out there serving and sacrificing on the front lines of freedom. I'm serious about making sure we have the best relationship with NGOs, who are such a force multiplier for us, such an important part of our combat team. We are all committed to the same singular purpose, to help every man and woman in the world who is in need, who is hungry, who is without hope, to help every one of them fill a belly, get a roof over their heads, educate their children. Of course, the last part is laudable, but it's interesting to think about the way that development workers, educators were reconstructed during this period as part of the combat team. And that combat team worked hand in hand with US military occupation, often in these provincial reconstruction teams, with development and taking place during the day, and squads of soldiers going out at night to hunt down mujahideen. So the kind of carrot stick, hand in hand work of counter-terrorism was very much part of the process. Just to finish off, I think there are a range of challenges for the field. Much of the critique of that early article that I talked about still holds, but there are many more critical and dissenting voices in our field. We need to, I think, to take a longer historical lens in understanding education in emergencies and try to link that past to the present and try to understand and push back against the kind of myopia that avoids some of these issues. And there are a range of initiatives that are emerging, but clearly there is a need, I think, to diversify and disrupt the field, both in terms of beyond Western bodies, but also in terms of Westocentric lenses, and try to open up the field to different ways of thinking and different ways of looking. And that extends to the need for more critical political economy lenses in teaching the new generation of practitioners as well as researchers who go on to work in these contexts and are faced with many of these challenges and decisions and need to understand the relationships within which they are engaged in. I think that there is a need for more research on agencies that are involved in that, and perhaps a time for an observatory, and also to think about stakeholders and who are stakeholders. Often in this field, when we think about stakeholders, we often think about the big international agencies, the big donors, but we should also recognize that parents' associations, trade unions, critical NGOs, social movements, these are all stakeholders, and we should be working and engaging with more of these to start to produce a more diversified field, a more open field, a more reflective field of the many challenges that are taking place in different contexts. And just to really to conclude, The rationale of the peer network was part of that attempt to open up and to reach out and to support young scholars, young early career researchers in Africa and Central Asia, and to try to share what we who have worked on this field for some decades have learned and researched about, and to share that and to learn from you who have lived in and out and within different situations, and between us to start to produce a new and diverse field that is open to the challenges that we all face. Thank you.
Thank you, Mario.